Welcome back for week 5 in our Pol 3 IPC journey. In this video, we're going to dive deep into international climate economics and the post-carbon transition. And a theme I want you to keep in mind as we go into this material is that the structure of the economy creates the structure of political power and political relationships. Now, to stabilise emissions below 1.5 degrees Celsius, there are a set of debates on how to decarbonise economic activity to maintain economic growth and what that would mean for existing economic institutions. But there's also another set of debates about whether the economic system needs to evolve beyond the logic of perpetual growth, because full decarbonisation might not be possible without some form of reduction in economic production and consumption. How this story plays out will help to define the contours of global political power in the coming decades. In this video, we're going to explore the core elements of economic systems in general, which will give us a framework for our exploration. Then we'll evaluate the ontological relationship between capitalism and the Earth. Then we'll look at some of the implications of climate change for production and consumption inequality, for exchange, money and finance, and for markets, institutions and green technology. We'll then finish up with a discussion about the transition to a post-carbon economy. Let's step back for a moment to the system level. All economic systems have the following structural elements. They derive natural resources from the earth. They have production, consumption and exchange of goods and services. They have some form of money and finance that facilitate production, consumption and exchange. They've got a system for managing labour and resources. They also have a system of institutions, laws, regulations and informal practices that govern how production, consumption and exchange takes place. They have arrangements for distributing surpluses and profits. They're built on a set of dominant technologies, and finally, they inevitably produce and dispose of waste products. Now, today's dominant capitalist economic system has its own variations of these structural features. And in this capitalist economic system today, each one of these elements is impacted by climate change in some way. So let's explore the climate angle on each of these structural elements. And remember, we're doing this from an international perspective at the level of the global economic system. This clip from the world-renowned Potsdam Institute in Germany illustrates where geographically greenhouse gas emissions have spiked, when historically this has occurred, and with relative representations of the quantities of the emissions generated. And I think this is an excellent representation of the historic relationship between industrialization and greenhouse gas emissions. The process of production, consumption and exchange, the processes that comprise economic activity, these ultimately rest on the transformation of material resources from the natural environment. In modern industrial economies that are powered by fossil fuels, there's therefore a clear correlation between economic activity and greenhouse gas emissions, which are the byproduct of burning fossil fuels. If economic activity increases, then inevitably greenhouse gas emissions also rise. And this is a pattern that's reflected in the data on greenhouse gas concentrations that date back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution onward. By transmuting vast amounts of natural resources into marketable products, capitalism has generated wealth and prosperity for some sections of the human family, and it's undeniably raised living standards for millions of people worldwide. However, in the process of transforming the material resources of the earth into economic goods, capitalism has commodified life as discrete units of production and consumption that can be extracted and traded and disposed of without any consideration for their interdependence with each other or for their connection to the health and stability of the ecosystems that they're from. And these ecosystems support life, including human life. So undermining those ecosystems undermines the preconditions for life, and human life in particular. Seems like a very silly survival strategy. Now we can see how this is problematic, for example, in the logging of the Amazon and in the logging of other old growth forests. So from a capitalist perspective, the wood has economic value as a commodity. The land has economic value as a commodity, but its ecosystem services, its value as an ecosystem as a whole, does not. So there's no value in the service that the forest provides in regulating the atmosphere as the lungs of the planet. So it's got no commercial value as a carbon sink, nor is the forest valued as a watershed or a biodiversity hotspot. This commodification of the Earth's resources is a symptom of and helps to reinforce this human separation with the rest of life. Now, this ontological separation is incompatible with Spaceship Earth, and it's incompatible with our attempts to try and do something about the climate change problem. We live in a globalized economic system in which the transnational production chains of the goods and services we consume stretch around the world across vast distances. These production chains begin with the extraction and refinement of resources, which are used in the manufacture of component parts, which are then assembled into value-added products. And then these are distributed for wholesale and finally retail sale to consumers. So each of these steps in the chain are often spread across multiple countries, and they're linked together by vast transportation and logistics networks. Every part of these production chains is itself composed of materials with their own production chains, linking the productive capacity of the global economy together in a colossal interconnected web. Every aspect of this global production web consumes resources and energy, which in turn emits greenhouse gases. Reducing the carbon footprint of this vast web of production and consumption is obviously complex. Transnational production chains are dominated by multinational corporations, and they operate across multiple national jurisdictions, which makes them hard to regulate. And this can be problematic where environmental regulations are concerned in particular. Their global scale is also often a function of the international division of labour, where different links in the production chain are performed where business costs, including labour costs, are the cheapest. Also, different states have different economic profiles and different developmental needs, as well as different levels of environmental regulation, all of which shape their national interests and incentives for cooperating on global climate mitigation. Consumption is the endpoint of these production chains, and if you think about it, it's integral to the process. But the more we consume, the greater our resource and carbon footprint, and consequently the greater our responsibility for greenhouse gas pollution. Also, because of extreme income inequality, both globally and within countries, the ability to consume is not distributed evenly. And this time series map of greenhouse gas emissions per capita shows this. Therefore, the responsibility for consumption-related carbon pollution is heavily weighted towards affluent societies and people with higher incomes. Conversely, as the IPCC has warned, climate change impacts are expected to exacerbate poverty in most developing countries and to create new pockets of poverty in both developed and developing countries. So this highlights the intersection between greenhouse gas pollution and economic justice. The global financial and monetary system is comprised of a set of government and multinational institutions, of markets and regulatory infrastructure that helps to facilitate the international flows of capital for investment and trade, and to set the exchange rates for national currencies that price these transnational transactions. That's a mouthful. They also play a more malign role as a site of speculation and profiteering that siphons money out of the real economy. A problem we see in the periodic crises like the global financial crisis of 2008. However, if we set aside the role of the financial and monetary systems in driving economic inequality just for a moment, these systems have another important flaw. And that's that they require perpetual economic growth to underpin the creation of money and the servicing of debts through fractional reserve banking. As we've seen previously, the correlation between economic growth and greenhouse gas pollution means that the monetary system ends up incentivizing carbon emissions, so it's part of the problem. There's an increasing awareness of the carbon bubble, which refers to investments in projects related to fossil fuels that are becoming stranded assets, or they're becoming worthless. The carbon bubbles emerged due to the growing realization that burning remaining fossil fuel reserves is likely to cause runaway global warming. So this is the unburnable carbon that we discussed in previous weeks. The International Energy Agency has stated that, quote, unabated combustion of all today's fossil fuel reserves would result in 3 times more CO2 emissions than the remaining carbon budget, unquote. Because of the carbon bubble, investment banks and financial institutions are becoming increasingly unwilling to invest in fossil fuel related projects because of the increasingly high risk of stranded assets, investments that they won't see a return on. So if we focus on the oil and gas industry as a case study, examples of potential stranded assets might include the oil and gas reserves themselves that are still in the ground awaiting production. It could include the exploration and development assets like drilling rigs and seismic vessels. It could include production and processing facilities like oil refineries and processing terminals, as well as distribution infrastructure like pipelines and tankers. If you're an oil company, that shit is bad news. But there's other investment risks as well. Climate change impacts could affect trade and global financial markets through more volatile costs of insurance, impacting the global network of legal and regulatory frameworks, impacting on the actors including international organizations and banks and corporations, all of the orgs that comprise the world financial system and to help facilitate capital flows. An increase in the frequency and the severity of natural disasters is already increasing the incidence of damage and destruction to physical assets that are insured or used as collateral in the financial system. So here's where it gets important. Banks can't offer finance where insurance is required as part of the collateral package for mortgages or loans, because of the risk of damage is too high because of climate impacts. Lack of insurance could be particularly damaging for small and medium enterprises who find it harder to access capital to protect against extreme events. So assets that are exposed to increasing climate hazard risk could decline in value as well, particularly if these risks become uninsurable. This graphic illustrates the broader regime complex in which the UNFCCC sits, and it illustrates the issue linkage with other international treaty regimes, and particularly those related to economics. Now, in the past, in instances where environmental treaties and economic treaties have come into conflict, the economic treaty usually takes precedence. Economic treaties tend to have a greater foundation of hard law, particularly around enforcement mechanisms, whereas environmental treaties have tended to be more based in soft law with weaker enforcement mechanisms. And this has occurred particularly in relation to the World Trade Organization, in which national environmental regulations have been struck down as a restraint on trade. However, as the Paris Agreement starts to be operationalized and as the climate crisis becomes more urgent, this imbalance is starting to shift. Climate change represents a colossal market failure because the failure to price carbon emissions into the cost of doing business assumes that the Earth has an endless capacity to absorb wastes, which, as we know, is a clearly false assumption. So greenhouse gas emissions are seen as externalities, or not part of the cost of business. So these costs instead have been socialized. They've been paid for outside of the market by governments or the public, rather than by the businesses that generate them. Now let's explore the logic of this. So capitalism is an economic system that's based on property ownership, capital accumulation, and profit maximization, most importantly. So in this system, all businesses aim to first minimize their production costs so that they can offer their product to consumers at the cheapest possible price, which enables them to capture as large a market share as possible, which in turn enables them to maximize profit. So in this context, addressing greenhouse gas pollution has been seen by some in the business world as an unnecessary market interference, And interestingly, when you drill down into the arguments of climate change deniers, it's this market interference angle that's really the crux of their problem with climate policy. So this is the context in which international environmental treaties have evolved. So they've been developed to attempt to massage a compromise with capitalism. In the functional language of environmental treaties and in the functional language of government climate policies, you see the language of environmental discourses like sustainable development and ecological modernization. So one of the key shared propositions of these two discourses is that economic growth can be decoupled from environmental degradation. Sustainable development promises that economic growth is the key to reducing ecological harms, and that economic development could provide the jobs, money, and infrastructure necessary to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and satisfy the development needs of poorer countries. In the classic definition from the 1987 UN report, Our Common Future, sustainable development is about meeting the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. The ecological modernization discourse, I think, outlines a pathway for the sustainable development agenda. It's premised on the assumption that capitalism can be greened through technological innovation and market mechanisms, and that this greening will be ultimately good for economic growth. According to this view, once the appropriate price signals and the appropriate regulations are in place, then market competition and the profit motive can take over, and this will drive technological innovation and efficiency gains. Increasingly profitable investments in green technology will deliver a zero carbon economy, leading to economies of scale that will bring down their cost. It's also argued that post-carbon transitions can be a strong driver of job creation, social justice, and poverty eradication. So does any of this language sound familiar? This is something that we're increasingly hearing in political discourses here in Australia as well as elsewhere. Sustainable development and ecological modernisation are the dominant discourses of climate economics in public policy and also in the business sector. And you can see this rhetoric clearly coded in the text of the Paris Agreement and in the broader UN development and environmental agenda, including the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, for example. The key intervention from a sustainable development and ecological modernisation perspective to address the externality of greenhouse gas pollution is a carbon price. Carbon price mechanisms are designed to force polluting businesses to internalise the cost of greenhouse gas pollution into their cost of business calculations. They're designed to send a market signal that spurs innovation in low carbon tech, as well as process inefficiencies. And the net intended result is a net reduction in carbon emissions as businesses reduce their exposure to the carbon price to stay competitive. So if you extrapolate that across the whole economy, the end goal is a significant widespread emissions reduction across the entire national economy. Now there's several models of carbon price. Now these range from emissions trading schemes to carbon taxes. An emissions trading scheme is based on tradable carbon credits, while a carbon tax imposes a flat tax on carbon per tonne. The map here on the slide illustrates the countries and the subnational jurisdictions that have implemented a carbon price mechanism of some kind as of 2019. So those in light blue and dark blue, they've implemented emissions trading schemes, while those in red and orange have implemented a carbon tax. Now, interestingly, Australia did have a carbon price. It had a hybrid carbon price model during the Gillard Labor government, but that was repealed under the Prime Ministership of Tony Abbott as part of the climate culture wars. Let's get now to the prospects for post-carbon economic transitions. And I really don't want to underplay just how difficult this is going to be. Post-carbon economic transitions involve fundamental transformational change across technologies and materials. They involve changing to organisational processes and institutional structures. as well as to politics and society and culture, in addition to the economy. So all of these different change processes are interrelated. Now, this graphic from the IPCC's fifth assessment report illustrates the share of greenhouse gas emissions across different sectors. And from this, we can infer clearly the scale and the scope of the transition challenge ahead. Now, there's broad agreement in most quarters now over the need to transition from fossil fuels and to decarbonize the global economy. So climate deniers aside, there is pretty strong momentum in this direction. However, because of the complexity of the task, there is not broad agreement on how to reach that goal. So there's plenty of divergence of opinion on how to get there, what the roadmap is. So the question is, will this transition be evolutionary or revolutionary? That's something that's up for grabs. The global economy's got an adaptation problem. The costs of climate change adaptation are becoming increasingly more expensive over time because you've got increasingly more frequent and intense extreme climatic events that are imposing damages and creating costs. So each time something like this happens, and cumulatively, they're causing ripple effects across the global economy. So the World Bank estimates that the cost between 2010 and 2050 of adapting to approximately 2 degrees Celsius warmer world is in the range of $70 billion to $100 billion a year. And this figure is likely to be well understated because it doesn't fully account for all of the costs and investments in adaptation covering all of the elements of adaptive capacity. And we'll get into adaptation more next week. There are significant challenges associated with post-carbon economic transitions. So the costs of achieving carbon neutrality are added on top of the costs of the damages of climate change impacts. And the cost of these economic transitions increase with the speed of the transition and depend on the carbon intensity of specific industries. So if you want to reduce emissions more quickly, the cost of doing so for most industries is going to be higher. Now, in any given industry, most forms of capital equipment generally have a lifespan of around 30 years or so. So switching to new technologies over that time frame would cost relatively little. However, if you're switching out your capital equipment over a shorter 10-year time span, for example, that would require companies to write off many existing assets. So they're going to incur a loss. Some economists also worry about supply shocks that might arise from the abrupt tightening of carbon emissions policies. And take this all together, this is why many in the business sector have argued for a more gradual emissions reduction pathway. And had the international community really started doing this in a concerted way 30 years ago, a gradual pathway would have been feasible. But what we've got is an extremely urgent and time-sensitive need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and atmospheric carbon concentrations now. And so inevitably, the cost of the transition is going to be higher because we have to do it more quickly. On the flip side, though, there are economic opportunities in the post-carbon transition. So for advocates of the Green New Deal and related initiatives around the world, they talk about the job opportunities in the renewable energy sector, or in retrofitting of urban spaces for climate mitigation and adaptation, or in food systems, or in other areas where the transformation requires work to be done. So this is basically a progressive version of the sustainable development and ecological modernization discourses that we see in the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, but with a more grassroots social justice element that reflects its origins in progressive environmentalism in the United States. But it's speaking a lot of the same language around green technology and green jobs and green growth. Now, a key question here is whether workers and communities who are reliant on transitioning out of the old polluting industries can benefit from these new opportunities. So are there communities that are going to be left behind in this transition? The International Labour Organization has argued for something called just transitions, where employees in transitioning industries are included as meaningful participants in the decision-making processes about their futures. and that they can be given livelihood pathways as their old jobs are phased out. So if you work in a coal mine, what are you going to do next? Are you just going to be stranded on the unemployment line, or are there pathways for you to find other employment quickly and not waiting a long period of time before you can find another way to earn a living? So we're likely to hear much more about just transitions in the political discourse around climate change in the coming years, and I bet this is something you'll hear in the next Australian federal election. But if we look beyond the idea of just transitions and the Green New Deal, there are other alternative visions for the economy and alternative visions for post-carbon transition. And we see this in ecological economics, for example, which talks about the relationships between ecosystems and economic systems through an expanded understanding of capital, which includes natural and social capital. So that expanded understanding of capital really eliminates the externalities problem. You've got donut economics or steady state economics, which theorize an economic system in which production, consumption, and exchange take place within the natural rates of replacement of key resources. The associated degrowth and simplicity movements argue for a reorientation of production and consumption towards sufficiency rather than growth. So that's a direct challenge to the perpetual growth model. You've got Marxist political economy, which aims to address exploitation and inequality to create a more just society in the process of addressing climate adaptation and mitigation. While you've got feminist economics, which recognizes the interdependent relationship between the productive and reproductive sphere, the relationship between paid and unpaid work, and between earning a living and caring for the family, and that these values should be incorporated into a climate response. So all of these are potentially important alternative approaches for enhancing climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And you're likely to see some of these ideas increasingly incorporated into more official government and business discourses over time. We can go even more grassroots from here, and we can look at the emerging collection of globally networked communities of practice that are based around different types of sustainable materialisms. And a shout out to my colleague David Schlossberg from Sydney, who has written a book on sustainable materialisms, from which this material comes. So sustainable materialisms embody the work of a growing number of environmental groups and practitioners who focus on more sustainable practices in everyday life, from the development of new food systems to community solar to sustainable fashion and a number of other things. So these people are motivated by a number of factors. They're, for one, frustrated with the lack of accomplishments of broader environmental policy. So they look at the UNFCCC and how damn slow it's been and think we can do better, we have to do better, we have to push the barrel. They come from a place of a desire for environmental and social justice and a distrust of traditional power structures and traditional industries. And they're looking for a form of sustainability that's more localized and personalized, that has a human touch rather than global production systems. Now, sustainable materialisms, this is a very broad umbrella. It includes movements like agroecology and permaculture. It includes ownership collectives and commons models. It includes cradle-to-cradle design and other kind of design systems, along with many other different elements. Now, what's most interesting to us from an IR perspective is the degree to which these movements are globally networked, and they're embedded as manifestations of the allied global climate change movement, which we'll touch on again in week 12. So there's an element of international organization in these local actions that's really interesting to IR practitioners. But here again, we come back to that ticking clock. Unfortunately, the time for gradual transitions is evaporating. A rapid emissions reduction effort is required to keep the Earth within that 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise envelope. The capitalist system that's defined how modern societies have interacted with the Earth since the Industrial Revolution is evolving. It's evolving into something different. We're seeing the beginnings of new isms, of new economic paradigms for a post-carbon economy. And I think this coming decade over the 2020s is going to be a really important period in this process.